we are back, finishing up. We got about 2 weeks left here in this series we've been in for a long time now, over a year. We're calling the First Gospel, and if you haven't been around for much of it, the idea is simple. We're going through the Old Testament and basically trying to show that the Old Testament is just as good as the New Testament. Often we look at the New Testament and we for obvious reasons, we see Jesus in there and we're like, he's amazing. There's no one like him. This is good news. As a matter of fact, we call the first 4 books of the New Testament, we call it good news, Gospels. My daughter and I were watching The Chosen last night. I'm sure some of you have seen that. It's good news, you know. You can't help but watch that and think this is really good. And what we're trying to show here in this series is that the same God that is Jesus, that is the good news in the New Testament, was doing the same sort of stuff in the Old Testament. It's a little more confusing for us because there's a lot more time that has elapsed between the Old Testament and now. And the culture was very different, and the people were different, and the language and the ideas were all different. And so sometimes we struggle to see the goodness, and sometimes we see stuff in there that's confusing, and we have to wrestle with it. But if you really wrestle and you dig in, you see that God is just as good. He has always been good, and he's always been working good into the world. That every time he speaks, it's good news. And this is his word, and therefore every time we open it, we have an opportunity to encounter like real, actual goodness. And that's what the series is about. We're calling the Old Testament the first gospel. Now, we're not the first ones to do this. I'm borrowing this from Christians, centuries ago. But the idea that this is also gospel, that when we read this, there is life, there is joy, there's hope, there's goodness here. And we've seen it, I think, for the past year and change as we've been working our way through. And we're coming toward the end of it. We've been kind of going somewhat chronologically so that we're not only learning theology, but also some history along the way. So we're sort of learning the flow of the story, that the Bible actually happened in a real time and a real place. It didn't happen in Narnia. These are not made-up stories, but it actually happened in the flow of world history. And so we've been kind of learning some of the history in the flow and have come to a time in the biblical history that we call the Exile. So essentially what happens is God's people were living in the promised land under the monarchy that God had established, Saul, David, Solomon. That kind of ended after Solomon and split up into 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom being called Israel, the southern kingdom called Judah. And as a result of their own poor choices, both of them faced significant opposition from great world empires. The northern kingdom was eventually destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. And a little while later, the southern kingdom was attacked, besieged, and eventually destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. So when the Babylonian Empire came in and laid siege to Jerusalem, they hauled the people of God off into exile in Babylon. This we talked about a little while ago as part of their empire building strategy. The basic idea was when you build an empire, you're essentially extending yourself beyond what your armies and your government can handle, right? So you've just now got too much land and too many people to manage. So you can't just put 1 million soldiers in every different location. That's not going to work. What you want to do instead is you want to move a bunch of the people out, especially the influential and powerful people. You want to move them out and bring them into your capital city, where you can treat them really well, take good care of them, and they will eventually assimilate into your culture. Meanwhile, you replace them with your own people out here, and what you end up with is a whole bunch of people that over the course of generations, it takes a couple generations, will all see themselves as Babylonian. So you end up kind of winning over hearts and minds that way, as opposed to, it's initially through military force, but you can't maintain through military force. Eventually, you have to control the population. That's what exile means. So the people of God were hauled off from Jerusalem into exile, actually 2 different waves of exile in Babylon. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about how the prophet Jeremiah, he was ministering during this time, and he wrote a letter to the first group of exiles that were sent off into Babylon. And this letter is found in the book of Jeremiah chapter 29. We talked about this, I think, it was 3 weeks back. And it's a crazy, crazy letter because it essentially says 2 things. It says, it's God's instructions through Jeremiah on how he wants his people to behave in exile, how he wants them to live in Babylon. And he says the craziest thing. He says, I want you to work for the good of the city I have sent you to. Now, why that's so crazy is because the Babylonians had just conquered them, had been oppressive and violent toward them. They were their enemies, and God is now saying, now that you are here in the context of their city, I want you to be people of peace. I want you to work for the good of the city. He said a bunch of things, but essentially he said, I want you to move in, Don't isolate yourselves. Don't just kind of create sort of an enclave of Israelites out here, but I want you to move into Babylon, integrate yourself into relationship with the people of the city. Don't be known as resistors, but look for common ground and find opportunities to bless the city. Crazy. Find opportunities to love and bless your enemies. In other words, God was telling them, I want this to be a missional exile. I have sent you here, not just as punishment, but with purpose, on mission. It's almost like God says, you were all kind of clumped up together in Jerusalem, and it was great for you. But the only way anybody else could participate in all this good stuff that was happening is if they came to Jerusalem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of you and I'm going to sprinkle you over here. And now all the people over here can experience it too. You guys have heard me say this a couple times. It's not my line, but it's a theologian once said, Christians are like manure. If you pile them up, they stink up the place. But if you spread them out, they fertilize the earth. Right? That's the idea here, is instead of making everybody come to our big kind of mega city, we're instead going to spread out so that God's goodness can be experienced across the world. And now, people in Babylon, what Jeremiah is saying is if you live well, people in Babylon will experience the glory of God through you. Pretty crazy. It's a missional exile. However, Jeremiah also says at the same time, don't forget who you are. Because that's the temptation. When you are sent into exile in another place, and you start to build relationships in that place, you start to work for the good of that city, your heart starts to get invested, it's possible to forget where you came from. It's possible to forget that your true home is the kingdom of God, and that is your primary citizenship. That's your primary identity. So don't ever forget who you are, because that has to drive everything. Even when you're living in exile, that still is the foundation of everything. That's the foundation from which you can bless them. If you become like the Babylonians and forget who you are, you have actually nothing with which to bless the city. You have no capacity to participate in God's goodness in this place anymore. So don't forget who you are. Remember. And that creates an interesting tension. On one hand, invest yourself fully. Be fully present here. Be relatable. Be close. Be near. But at the same time, be distinct. Be conspicuously different. Now, how do we do that? So Jeremiah 29 was kind of the theory. This is what it should look like. The text we're going to read tonight is what it looks like in practice, okay? We're going to read out of the book of Daniel, which is a really great book, chapter 3, famous story you guys have heard before. And basically we're going to talk about three guys named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three guys were in the first wave of exiles from Jerusalem, meaning they were the target audience for Jeremiah 29. When Jeremiah wrote that letter, he sent it to these guys, and they read it. And here, we get to now see a case study of what they did with that letter, how they lived out their identity in exile, okay? So here we go. I'll move to the side so you can see the screen here. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plains of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So, the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and people of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and pipes and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all nations and people of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that whoever hears the sound of the horn," why couldn't they just say the instruments? "The horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold." and whoever doesn't fall down and worship will be thrown into the blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought to the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you don't worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve you or your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him, and they defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be cut into pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." What a story. It's a story about some guys who figure out how to live this life in exile, how to walk in this tension of being fully invested in the city, yet distinct in their identities, remembering who they are, remembering who God is, and remembering why they exist. And that's difficult to do. It's difficult to do in exile because, as I said a second ago, exile is designed to lure you away from your core identity. I mean, that's the whole purpose of it. In the ancient world, that was the very idea, is you move these guys from where they were to a new place in order to give them a new identity, to sort of spoon feed over time a new identity into them so that they become Babylonian and lose their purpose, lose their identity as the people of God. That's the whole idea. It's simple. Once we've done that, then they can live anywhere in the empire. They can be useful to us in the empire. Exile exists to take your identity away from you, and it works really simply. First of all, you move people from one place to another. Because even here in our world today, identity is tied to location. Where you live forms the basis of your identity. You get used to everything that's around you, and if you end up having to go to a new place, it's disorienting. I've traveled a lot. Sometimes I've traveled alone, and you would think that I get used to it, but I still, when I find myself in a new place, I find myself disoriented sometimes. The foods, the sights, the smells, whatever else, even just shopping in a new place. I need to go out and buy some shoes. I don't understand how sizes work here. This is very confusing. I don't understand the food. I don't really understand the money. There's nothing more humiliating than being in a new place and somebody saying, "This is how much it costs," and you just stand there with this money in your hand, like here, just take what you want. I don't know what you're saying to me. But that's what it is. A new place is disorienting, and especially when in that world, place was infused with a holy power. I mean, this was God's promised land. This is where he dwelled with his people. They built Yahweh's temple in the middle of Jerusalem. That's where the Ark of the Covenant sat. The very presence of God dwelled in that place, and that defined the entire culture. It defined the entire people. They were a people defined by the presence of God. Remember in Exodus, they say, God, if your presence doesn't go with us, we don't want to go, because your presence is everything to us. And so when they're removed, it's not just that they lost their favorite restaurants or or couldn't speak the language or didn't understand the money. It's also that they felt like they were ripped away from the presence of God, the thing that defined them. Again, all this is by design. It's disorienting. And now once they're in this new place, what happens to them? They're given a new name. If you read the story, earlier in the story in Daniel, their names were initially not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, why is this important? I mean, obviously, giving somebody a new name, naming is just important in general. When you give somebody a name, you kind of give them an identity, right? So taking away their old name and giving them a new name is very symbolic. It's a power move, but at the same time, you have to know what their old names meant. Hananiah means God is gracious. Mishael means who is like God. Azariah means God is my help. So all their names are based on who God is to them. When they moved to Babylon, Shadrach means under the command of the moon god. Meshach means who is like Aku. So exactly, they took his name, his initial name, Mishael, who is like God. Meshach, who is like this other god, right? Abednego, servant of Nebo, another Babylonian god. So they're given names to relate to the new gods of Babylon that they're supposed to be worshiping. So they've taken away everything they knew, taken them out of what they saw as the presence of God, taken them away from the temple, given them a new name that's based upon a new identity, new gods to worship, and then they treated them really well. See, the Babylonians the exile doesn't mean prison. They weren't throwing anybody in prison. They gave them high positions in government. They gave them nice houses to live in. They fed them well. They offered them a new life with all of the different features and all the trappings of wealth and influence and power. Why? Because there is nothing so mind-numbing as comfort. There's nothing so detrimental to our identities as ease. When everything is easy, we get soft. The edge goes off of us. It's easy to forget. You remember in Greek mythology, there's the stories of the lotus eaters, right? These people are on a quest. I think, is this in the Odyssey? I think it might be in the Odyssey, where they're on a quest trying to get back home again, and they come across this island of the lotus eaters. And when they're there, they eat this stuff that makes them forget. And it's this island of pleasures, and they're having all this fun, but they forget who they are and what they're about. I'm sure I just messed up that story entirely, because it's not in my notes. It just came to mind just now. But you get the idea. That's what comfort and ease does. It makes us forget who we are. And so here they have new names, in a new place, so completely disoriented, renamed, treated well, given comfort and ease. And now, when the time is right, the final phase of exile is now bow down to our gods. Now notice this doesn't happen back in Jerusalem. The Babylonians could have done this. They could have waltzed into Jerusalem, dragged some big statue and said, okay, everybody bow down now or we'll kill you. What would have happened? We know from history. Every Jew would have resisted and been slaughtered. That happened over and over and over again. Would have never worked. Instead, take them away, disorient them, treat them well, and then give them something to bow down to as the final straw. And now Nebuchadnezzar's smart here. He knows that if they bow down to worship, he's got them. That they have now fully embraced their identity as Babylonian. Because why? We are what we worship. We are what we worship. Whatever you bow down to will define your life. The Bible talks about idols in this way. It says, those who worship them become like them. If you bow down to an idol, whatever you give the most of your time and your attention and your affection to is what will define your life. And Nebuchadnezzar knows, if I can get them to bow down to this statue, if I can get them to worship this, then they have become like us. They have become Babylonian. They have fully forsaken their old identity. None of us can escape worship. Whatever we're worshiping completely defines our lives. So if they bow down, I've got them. They've embraced a new identity. They're my people. Okay? That's the temptation of exile. That's how exile works. That's how it makes us forget who we are. Now, in this situation, how do Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, how did they respond? And I want to ask this in two ways. First, I want to ask how they actually responded. So, practically speaking, what did they say? What did they do? And then I want to ask how did they respond in that way? So, what was it that enabled them to do what they did? Okay, because that's how life works. If you ever see somebody do something great, there's always the great thing they did, and then there's always the million things behind the great thing they did that enabled them to do that. You know, if you like to watch football, you see these athletes do incredible things on the field, and that catch that just blows our minds was trained in thousands upon thousands of hours of practice. And the same is true of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They have a response that can only be described as heroic. But I have to think that they didn't just arrive to that moment of crisis and have that response right on the tip of their tongues, but that they had trained it in quiet hours well before this. So how did they respond? Well, in the moment, I want to tell you first what they didn't do. They didn't pitch a fit. Okay, now here's the situation. Nebuchadnezzar is demanding that they bow down to this God, which in their minds they knew was wrong. Demanding that they bow down or they be killed in a horrific way. In other words, they were facing great injustice and brutality, but they didn't throw a fit. They didn't yell. They didn't scream. Notice they didn't even try to defend themselves. Did you hear them say that? O king, we don't need to defend ourselves to you in this matter. What does that mean? No excuses, no rationale, no justification, no explaining, no quoting of scripture, no picketing, no yelling, no fighting. As a matter of fact, you can see from their tone that they are downright respectful to the man who's about to end their lives, to the man who's treating them with such brutality and injustice. They are so respectful. And I just think it's just Jeremiah 29. You guys notice that? That's what they're doing here. They're in this situation where they are working for the good of the city even as they face their death. They're looking at the king of Babylon, and they're working for his good even in this moment. They know that if they protest, if they yell, if they scream, if they weep, if they wail, if they do anything, they're going to get in the way of the glory of God. It's really interesting. I think they're doing something that Christians used to be very concerned about. I think they were protecting their witness. You know what I mean? I used to hear Christians say that all the time. You guys, if you've been around church for a long time, you might have, that might be a phrase you've heard before. I don't want to ruin my witness. What does that mean? That means that Christians had a sense that, like, I need to live my life in such a way that if anybody finds out that I'm a Christian, it won't be weird to them. They won't think, really? You don't act like one. Or it won't get in the way of me being able to speak or share who God is. In other words, the way I'm acting will be congruent with the goodness of God. And it will actually create a pipeline or a conduit through which the glory of God can flow. Because it's possible for God's people to get in the way of the glory of God, to create a barrier or a wall that God has to break through. And what they seem to want to do here is instead say, I just want to create an opportunity for God's glory to be seen. I don't want to ruin my witness. I don't want to get in the way of what God might want to do in this time. So, very simple, their response. We're not going to defend ourselves to you. And that's not disrespectful. It's not mean. It's just, we're not going to try to explain this away. We're also not going to bow. Because our God is able to deliver us from your hand. And he's, with all due respect, he's better than you. That's it. With all due respect, if you're going to force us to choose between you and him, we're going to choose him every time. It's as simple as that. because he's better. He's worth it. That's their statement. And they are, in this moment, they are resisting. Notice, they're resisting Nebuchadnezzar's command. But they're doing it in a way that is hospitable almost, invitational, that creates an opportunity for God to do something. They're not resisting in a way that's just for the sake of resistance, you know? Sometimes I think that we do that as Christians. We just want to be oppositional. We want to just find something to be angry about or worried about or stressed about. These are not people who are oppositional. These are people they're working in government. You know, when we get these long lists of satraps and prefects and whatever else, they're one of them. They're government officials. They have invested in the city. They're working for the good of the city. They're not known as people who are oppositional. They're not going around with a victim mentality. They have been doing the good work. They're not resistors. The only reason they resist in this moment is because Nebuchadnezzar has challenged the supremacy of God. This is not protest for protest's sake. This is not them defending themselves. This is them standing on principle, defending the character and the goodness of God. That's what it comes down to. They're not resisting Nebuchadnezzar. They're resisting the idol. I think Paul in Ephesians would say, be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because they weren't fighting against flesh and blood. They were fighting against spiritual forces. They were fighting against darkness. As a matter of fact, if you see where the story goes, you could make the case that they were fighting for Nebuchadnezzar. That they realized that he and the rest of Babylon were held enslaved to spiritual powers, that this idol represented a dark spiritual power that was creating devastation in the city, and they were resisting that in a way that would enable the glory of God to flow. That's what happens, right? If you read the rest of the story, God's glory is seen by Nebuchadnezzar, by all of the governors and the officials crowded around. They realize in this moment there's a spiritual revelation, a breakthrough that happens because these men resisted the powers. They didn't resist the people. They weren't trying to be oppositional against people. They were fighting for people in their resistance. I think this is really important for us as Christians, as God's people. When we go out there in the world and we see darkness and devastation, and oftentimes we see it in people because it's people who are victimized, it's people who are brutalized by darkness and devastation. We see it manifest through their lives, but we need to be able to look through that to see the goodness of God and draw it out. And so we're not opposing people. We're not oppositional. We're not fighting our enemies out there, at least enemies who are flesh and blood. We're fighting against the enemy of our souls, the one who is holding people in slavery, in darkness and in devastation. We're not resisting them. We're resisting evil. Right? That's what these guys are doing. They were fighting for the people of Babylon, even in this moment of darkness. So they resisted, yes, but respectfully, bravely, in a way that's so faithful. And I just look at them and I want to say, like, how did you do it? Now, we're not going to face stuff like that on a regular basis. None of us are going to likely be threatened with being thrown into a fiery furnace or whatever else, but we will face some of the identity challenges that they faced. You know? We will find ourselves in this world disoriented. Happens to me almost every week. I don't know why, like, God and life makes so much sense in church. Anybody else experience that? I think this is by design. I think we're supposed to come into church and feel like reoriented. Like, okay, like I understand I understand who I am, who God is, and why I'm here. But then the second we walk out that door, we're back in Babylon again. You know? And it's like super disorienting and confusing. And you're given new names out there, for sure. Not all of them are negative, but the world's going to name you with all sorts of stuff. It'll name you by your profession. It'll name you by your accomplishments. It'll name you by your looks. It'll name you by your age, by your ethnicity, whatever else. It'll give you all sorts of names. Some of them are fine. They're not necessarily negative, but they're not your true identity. Name you by your political affiliations, you know, by your whatever it is. And we have to kind of fight to stand on, no, but who I am at my core is Christian, defined by Jesus, a servant and a child of the King. And there's going to be all sorts of comforts and all sorts of things out there that will entice and distract. I mean, man, distraction in this day and age is, I think, one of the primary opponents to the life of God in us. I think the devices we carry in our pockets, I have one in my pocket right now. Oh, I don't. That's my microphone. I thought I did. I felt the weight, and I was like, no, I don't. It's somewhere else. But the point is, I think that opposes our relationships to Jesus. Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a distraction. It's a comfort. It's a way of tuning out when we need to be tuning in. So we can resonate with their story. And at some point, you're going to be asked to bow down. You're going to be asked to give your affection, your loyalty, your worship, your time, your energy, your money, your whatever else, to something other than God. To give priority to something other than Him. Our story is their story. We're living in exile. And our challenge is, how do we then enter into this space? Because it's going to happen out there. The answer, Jeremiah told us, is not just to stay in here where things make sense. The answer is not to go to church 7 days a week. The answer is not to only hang out with Christians. That's not the answer. You're still supposed to go out into the city, into exile, but do it in a way that you don't lose your identity. So how? How did they do it? How did they manage to hold on, resist evil without resisting people, resist without anger, without animosity, without yelling and screaming, without drawing attention to themselves, but instead by directing all attention to God? How did they do it? I think the answer is in the statement they made. They had a clear picture of who God was. Their statement that they make right there is just so profound and so simple and so compelling. Remember, did you notice what they said there? O King, we don't need to defend ourselves from you in this matter, because our God is able to deliver us from your hand, and He will. Okay? So they had a clear picture of what God could do. They knew that if He wanted to, He could get them out of this fire. Our God is able to deliver us from your hand. But notice what they go on to say. But, and this is some of the most heroic words you will ever hear anywhere, but even if He does not, we won't bow. In other words, they knew not only what God could do, they also knew who He was. They had faith in His ability, but more than that, they had faith in His character. Does that make sense? It's one thing to know that He can do something. It's another thing to know that if He chooses not to, He's still good. Because sometimes He chooses to say no. Sometimes He doesn't rescue. Sometimes He doesn't heal. And what they're saying here is we know Him well enough to know that if He says no, if He lets us burn, then it's going to be okay. He's still good. He's still better than you, O King. He's not just better than you because He's going to deliver us. He's even better than you if He doesn't. They had faith not just in an outcome, but in a person. I trust you. That's what they're saying in this moment. I trust you. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what you're going to do. I know I'm going to go into that fire because I will not bow. I know I'm going to go in, but I trust you. Whatever happens. They were men whose lives were defined by faith in the character of God. They knew who He was. They knew who He was. And they knew He was better than anything else. How did they hold on to that in Babylon? I mean, we don't know, but I could guess. I could guess that they sat around and they told stories to each other out of Scripture. I bet they did. I bet they had devotionals at night together. You know, I bet that after a hard day at the office, they came home. Shadrach walks in the door kind of dejected, and the other two look at him and said, Mishael, don't forget who you are. And then they told him stories of the faithfulness of God. I bet they got together in community and told stories. I bet they spent time on their knees in individual prayer, day in and day out, reminding themselves who God was, even in Babylon, seeking his face, even when he couldn't be seen anywhere around them. I bet that they had habits and disciplines that soaked themselves, that saturated themselves in the story of God, that enabled them to go out into Babylon and not lose their identity, so that when the moment of crisis came, they were able to resist in a way that created an opportunity for the glory of God to be seen. Amazing, heroic men of faith. And I want to be like them, because we're in their situation on the regular. But at the end of the day, that's not what this story is about. It's good, but it's not what it's about. At the end of the day, the story is about a God who walks in the fire with them. That's the most stunning feature of the story, isn't it? It's not just about men of heroic faith. It's about a God who walks in the fire with his people. Because think about it for a second. There were a million different ways God could have delivered them from this fire. You know? He could have just made them fireproof. You know, he could have turned the wrath of the fire on the Babylonians and burned them up instead. He could have just put the flames out, extinguished them. He could have done anything. But he does the most remarkable thing. He lets them go into the fire and then goes in himself with them. Nebuchadnezzar looks in the fire and he says, "I'm so confused. Didn't we throw 3 guys in there?" Yeah, there's 3 guys. I remember. Well, then why are there 4? And one of them, notice what he says, one of them looks like a son of the gods. He goes on to say, this is the angel of the Lord, which we learned a long time ago. The angel of the Lord is not just an angel of the Lord, but is an Old Testament manifestation of Jesus of Nazareth walking around in the flames with them. God comes into the fire with them himself and walks around. Why? Because this is the kind of God he is. He was never a God distant from his people. If you've been following this story closely, at every crucial moment in the story, he shows up himself and speaks to his people and comforts his people and reveals himself to his people. He is with his people. His presence defines them. So in this moment, he's not just going to rescue them from a distance. He's going to come into the fire himself, because that's the kind of God he is. He is with you in the fire. He's not sitting up in heaven watching. He's not pulling the strings like a puppet master. He's not moving around pieces like a chess player. He's with you in the fire. I think of Psalm 139, this psalm about the presence of God. David says, where can I go from his presence? If I make my bed, this is the craziest line. He says, if I make my bed in the depths of hell, even there you're with me. Do you hear that? David is convinced that if he goes down to the very darkest places in all of creation, that God will go with him. Because that's the kind of God he is. Why was God with them in the fire? Because they were afraid. And when God's people are afraid, he sends his presence, himself. He shows up himself to comfort them. Think of David in Psalm 46. He says, God is my refuge and strength, and ever-present help in trouble. Therefore I will not fear, though the earth give way. God is my refuge and my strength and ever-present help. He's always with me in trouble. When his people are afraid, his presence is comfort. It's peace. Again, it doesn't mean you don't go into the fire, but it means he's going to be with you, and his presence will bring you hope. Why was he in the fire with them? Because he wanted the Babylonians to see what kind of God he was. I love that Nebuchadnezzar issued the command he did. Bow down to me, or I will throw you into the fire, and then what God will be able to deliver me? And it's like Yahweh is saying, hold this for a second. I was going to say hold my beer, but you can't say that in church, right? That feels sacrilegious. Yeah, there you go. Watch this. What God can deliver me? Well, let me show you. And the end of this story is crazy, because everyone in Babylon, the king of Babylon, sees him and issues this stunning confession of faith. There is no, the king of Babylon, as a result of all this, says there is no God like theirs. There is no God that can save like this one. And I wonder if he's not just saying there's no God that can, because I think I read that and I thought it means there's no God that can save other than this one. But I wonder if what he's saying is there's no God that can save like this one. In other words, that would actually show up himself and save from inside the fire. I can't imagine. I think what he might be saying is, I can't imagine one of our stupid Babylonian gods showing up and walking into the fire with them. I can't possibly see it happening. But this one did. He walked in. And I love this, because when he shows up in the fire with them, notice what happens. They go into the fire. And this seems like overkill. But Nebuchadnezzar bound them and threw them into the fire. They go into the fire bound, and the only thing that burns in the fire is the ropes. They come out free. All the fire did to them was free them, because he was with them. And all Babylon saw it. This is part of God's plan to show his glory to the nations. He did not spare them from the fire, because he wanted the nations to see how his people walk through the fire differently. That when they go in it, it doesn't destroy them. But I show up myself with them in it and lead them through it into a new place of freedom. I think this story is just about as good as it gets. It shows these three really good men. And it shows us an example of how we can live in this exile that we find ourselves in. But at the same time, and far more significantly, it shows us the God who is with us in it, day in and day out, walking through the fire, turning the flames even of this life, of this exile, for our good and for our freedom. So if you're in it right now, just know that there is one like a son of the gods standing right beside you, taking the flames with you and transforming them, so that at the end of all this, and there will be an end, it won't last forever, but at the end of all this, the ropes will be gone and you'll be free. And everybody around you will see how good he is. Let's pray. God, thanks so much for this church. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the truth of all of it. I have seen it to be true in my life, that you have been the one in the fire with me. And I know that my friends in this room have as well. And we want to thank you for that, first and foremost. We want to thank you that you are a God who walks through the fire with us. Thank you for the many, many fiery furnaces that you've seen us through. Thank you for being with us moment by moment, day by day, in this crazy world that tries to rip away our identities. Thanks for reminding us who we are and who you are. So thank you, first and foremost. And Lord, I do pray for myself and for any in this room who are right now facing a fiery furnace. I pray first and foremost that you give us the courage not to bow, not to bend a knee to anything but you, to worship you and you alone with our whole hearts, because you are better than anything else. And I pray that as we do, as we move forward with even just a mustard seed of faith, that you would respond with presence, that you would be the defining feature of our life, that you would be so near to us in every fire, and that everyone would see your glory. Pray this in your name. Amen.